They took my house keys before I even understood what was happening, and the worst part wasn't their hands closing over mine. It was the look they shared, as if I were already halfway gone. At 74, I thought I'd earned at least the dignity of being spoken to, not handled like someone who might wander into traffic. But children have a strange way of deciding things for you once they believe age has emptied your head. Mine didn't even wait for proof. I stood on my own front porch, the wood warm from the late afternoon sun, still wearing my coat because they hadn't let me step fully inside. My daughter Chloe held my elbow lightly, carefully, as if any firmer grip might bruise me and any looser one might let me escape. Steve, my son, had the keys already in his pocket. I heard them clink when he stepped back, a sound I had heard my entire adult life. Except this time, the house behind us wasn't his. It was mine. "Mom," he began, lowering his voice like we were discussing bad test results, not my own door. "The doctor said you should avoid strain." "The doctor said my hip was fine," I answered. "A bruise, nothing more." They exchanged that look again. Pity mixed with a certainty that frightened me more than any fall could. "You forgot the appointment time twice this week," Chloe said softly, "and you left the kettle on." "I turned it off," I corrected. "You arrived before it finished boiling, that's all." They didn't argue, which told me they didn't care about the details. The decision wasn't about facts. It was about convenience dressed as concern. Their faces carried a strained sweetness, the kind adults use with children who might cry if challenged. I recognized it. I'd used it on both of them when they were small. "What exactly are you doing?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, though I felt the tremor in my fingers. "Why do you have my keys?" Steve cleared his throat. "We just want to make sure you're safe until we figure out the long-term plan." "Long term?" I repeated. "For what? I fell once on an uneven sidewalk." "Once." Chloe touched my arm again. "Mom, living alone is getting harder for you. We worry." I looked at her carefully. Her hair perfect, her nails glossy, her shoes barely creasing the porch wood. She hadn't lived here a single full day since she was 19. She worried? Yes, but not enough to learn the difference between a kettle left on and a kettle that hadn't boiled yet. "I've lived alone for 8 years," I reminded them. "I've managed my bills, my medications, my appointments." "We know," Steve said, "and we're proud of you, truly, but things are changing." Changing for whom, I wondered. For them, who now lived in larger houses than I ever dreamed of owning. For them, who grumbled about the market prices rising and joked about how I was sitting on a gold mine. For them, who had started speaking of my home as if it were already a number on a spreadsheet. "Give me my keys," I said quietly. Steve shook his head, his eyes soft but immovable. "Not yet. Just until we get everything sorted. We've already spoken to someone who can guide us. A specialist in elder care." The phrase slid into my chest like a cold needle. Not a doctor, not a therapist. A specialist in control. I felt the truth settling with a kind of hollow clarity. They weren't reacting to my fall. They'd been preparing for this moment. Perhaps waiting for the right excuse. Chloe stepped inside first, motioning for me to follow. As if it were her house. As if she were welcoming me into some supervised accommodation. I stood frozen on the threshold, watching her move through my living room, adjusting a cushion, picking up my mail as if she'd been appointed keeper of my life. Steve lingered beside me. "We're doing this for your own good, Mom." I looked at the door frame, at the chipped white paint my husband and I had applied years ago. I thought of all the evenings I'd sat inside with a book, the meals I'd eaten, the conversations I'd had with myself when the world grew too quiet. I had never feared this house. Not once. It was the safest place I'd known. Your concern, I said finally, feels a lot like taking. Steve sighed, already impatient. You'll understand later. For now, let us handle it. I stepped inside because arguing on the porch felt like surrendering the entire neighborhood the right to witness my humiliation. The air smelled the same, faint lemon polish and old books, yet something had shifted. My home felt borrowed. My steps felt monitored. Chloe was already reorganizing my medication shelf, her brows knitting with exaggerated worry. We'll go through all this tonight. Make sure everything's in order. I nodded, though my throat tightened. I watched them move through the rooms with a confidence that wasn't earned. They believed they had already won some battle I hadn't agreed to fight. But I am not as fragile as they think. I may be 74, but my mind is clear, my memory sharp, and the quiet in me is not weakness. It is patience. And patience in the right hands can be sharper than any blade. The next morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps in my hallway, the confident kind that belong to people who believe they have every right to be where they are. I had slept poorly, not from fear or age, but from a restless awareness that something in my home had shifted. When I opened my bedroom door, Chloe was already in the kitchen, pulling open cabinets as if taking inventory. "Good morning, Mom," she said brightly, too brightly. "I thought I'd get a head start on organizing things." "Organizing what?" I asked, though I already knew. She held up a box of cereal. "Expiration dates, storage, systems." I had lived 74 years without Chloe's systems. I wasn't sure why she believed I needed them now, but she spoke with the authority of someone who has decided the debate is over. Steve arrived 10 minutes later, letting himself in with a firm twist of the knob, like the house belonged to him. He didn't bother knocking. "We need to check the smoke alarms," he said, lifting a small ladder from the trunk of his car. "And we're going to install a couple of safety cameras." I looked at him, not angry, just looking. "Cameras?" "By the entryway and the kitchen," he said. "For your protection." Protection. The word always sounds noble when used to explain control. I sat at my table while they walked around my house, talking quietly to each other in the tired tone of people performing an unpleasant duty. Every few minutes, Chloe would glance over at me with that same tight smile, the kind that says I love you, but I don't trust you. They unplugged my old radio because the wiring might be bad. They labeled every bottle in my bathroom cabinet, including the soap. They tightened the shower rail. They rearranged my pantry so everything would be easier to reach. I didn't ask for any of it. I didn't need any of it. I watched them work like two people settling into a new property and preparing it for inspection. When they checked the refrigerator, Chloe hummed disapprovingly at the sight of leftovers. "You shouldn't eat anything older than 2 days," she said. "We'll bring meals from now on." Meals from them, not meals with me. That distinction wasn't lost. Steve installed the first camera near the front door. The little red light blinked to life, watching, recording. A stranger in my home, silent and loyal only to their narrative. "Where will the footage go?" I asked. "To our phones," he said casually. "We'll get alerts if anything seems off." "Off," I repeated. "Like what?" Just anything." He meant if I opened the door alone, if I cooked at the wrong hour, if I dared to live without their supervision. While they worked, I made coffee the way I always do. 2 scoops, level, not heaping. I poured water to the exact line on the kettle, just as I had thousands of mornings before. My hands were steady, my mind clear. But Chloe hovered nearby, watching closely, ready to intervene if I so much as misplaced the lid. "Mom," she said gently, "why don't you sit down? Let me handle that." "Do I look unable to pour water?" I asked. "It's not about ability," she insisted. "It's about risk." Risk. Another noble word with a sharp edge hidden behind it. I carried the mug to the table anyway. Slowly, yes. Carefully, yes. But on my own. The small victory tasted better than the coffee. They stayed until nearly noon, moving through the rooms with the restless energy of people preparing for a house that isn't quite theirs, but soon might be. Before leaving, Steve placed a new lock on the inside of the back door, one that needed a code I wasn't given. "Just temporary," he said, "until we have everything settled." Everything settled. Their favorite phrase. Chloe kissed my cheek before she left, soft and patronizing. "Mom, just try to understand. We're trying to help." "I know what help looks like," I said. "This doesn't resemble it." She didn't answer. She only brushed a crumb from my sleeve as if tidying me were part of the housework. When they finally left, silence settled around me like dust after a storm. The camera light blinked in the corner. The door felt heavier with its new lock. Even the air had a different quality, like it had been handled too much. I walked from room to room, touching the furniture, the books, the framed photos. They were unchanged, yet the relationship between me and the space felt altered. My home had always been my companion. Now it watched me with suspicion, as if waiting to report back. I sat in my chair at the window, where I'd spent countless evenings reading or thinking or simply being. The street was quiet. Mrs. Lang from next door watered her flowers. A young couple walked their dog. Ordinary life continued outside without any knowledge of what had happened to mine. I wasn't frightened. Not yet. But I felt the early shape of something sharp pressing into my days. A sense that my life was being slowly boxed, labeled, and stored away. They thought they were being protective. They thought I would accept it quietly. They thought age had softened me into compliance. But they were wrong in ways they had never bothered to imagine. For the next 2 days, they came and went, as if my doorstep had become a revolving door. They never stayed long, but they never left me alone either. Each visit had a purpose, though none of those purposes were mine. By Thursday afternoon, I began to understand the new rhythm of my life. An hour of quiet, then footsteps. A cup of tea half finished before Chloe arrived with another list of tasks. A moment of peace broken by Steve's knock, too firm to ignore. None of it frightened me. But the pattern told me something important. They weren't reacting to a crisis. They were preparing to establish one. On Friday morning, Chloe arrived earlier than usual, dressed in her work clothes, neat and urgent. "Mom, I'm going through your mail," she said, as if she'd been assigned the job by a committee. "It's piling up." "It wasn't piling up until you started reorganizing the table," I said. But she wasn't listening. She flipped through envelopes quickly, scanning return addresses. I recognized her expression. It was the same one she used when searching for misplaced jewelry, intent, restless, impatient to find whatever she already believed was missing. Then she paused over one envelope. A thin, cream-colored one. My investment account. Before I reached her, she had already torn it open. "Chloe," I warned. "This is important," she said, eyes darting across the page. "We need to understand your financial picture if we're going to make long-term plans." There was that word again. We. As if her hands had suddenly earned the right to rearrange the architecture of my life. She frowned. "Mom, you withdrew more than usual last month. Why? What's this for?" "My new water heater," I said calmly, "which I paid for myself." Chloe blinked, surprised at the simplicity of the answer. It hadn't occurred to her that my choices might be deliberate. She set the paper aside, but too neatly, too purposefully, as if she planned to look at it again later. I slipped it into my pocket without comment. Her brows tightened, but she said nothing. 2 hours later, Steve came by to check the basement lighting, though he'd never cared about my basement in all the years he lived here. He went down the stairs with the casual confidence of someone entering a storage space he already believed was half his. I followed slowly, not because my legs were stiff, though they were, but because I wanted to see what he was really after. He wasn't fixing lights. He was assessing. My basement is small, lined with shelves of old tools, winter coats, and the boxes of paperwork my late husband insisted on keeping. Steve opened cupboards, glanced through containers, and checked for valuables not with curiosity, but with an appraiser's eye. "Mom, you really should consider simplifying," he said, rifling through a plastic bin. "Some of this old stuff is a hazard." I watched him quietly. "A hazard to whom?" He hesitated. "To you." He didn't realize he had answered honestly. Not about me, but about himself. My belongings weren't hazards. They were obstacles, evidence, records, proof of my competence. I let him look. People reveal more through searching than through speaking. When he finally went upstairs, I stayed behind for a moment in the dimness of the basement. Dust floated through the shaft of light from the window. The house felt different down there, untouched by their new rules. My steps echoed the way they always had. My memory felt steady. My breath, calm. On my way back up, I noticed Steve's jacket hanging on the chair, his phone half slipping from the pocket. I didn't mean to touch it. I only saw the screen light up on its own, displaying a text preview. "The paperwork should be ready Monday. Once the evaluation is filed, you'll have grounds." I didn't see the sender's full name, just the office abbreviation. A law firm. Grounds. The word hit me with the quiet force of a hammer. So that was the plan. Not care, not safety, not concern. A legal foundation to take control before I realized what they were building. Steve returned just as I stepped away from the chair. He didn't know I'd seen anything. He only grabbed his jacket and said he'd be back tomorrow, with a specialist. I nodded, as if he'd told me the weather forecast. After he left, I sat with my hands folded on the table, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. The house felt like a body holding its breath. Their visits, their organizing, their cameras. None of it had been clumsy or reactive. It had been sequence, preparation, like workers laying scaffolding around a building before renovation. But I was not a structure to be rebuilt or repurposed. I was a woman with a mind still sharp and a dignity sharper still. And now that I knew what they were reaching for, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. A steady, unmistakable sense of direction. This wasn't fear. It was readiness. By Saturday morning, their confidence had grown into something almost practiced. They no longer pretended to be dropping by. They entered as people who expected the door to open before their hand even reached the knob. I heard the car doors slam, then the familiar synchronized steps up my walkway. 2 sets of feet. Their rhythm had become too familiar. Steve let himself in with the same automatic twist of the wrist. The sound of the lock yielding to him felt different now that I knew he intended it permanently. Chloe followed, carrying a tote bag filled with containers, cleaning wipes, and paperwork I hadn't asked for. "Morning, Mom," she chirped, already scanning the room. "We're going to tackle your medication schedule today. It's been on my mind." "It hasn't been on mine," I replied. She ignored that, placing the tote on the table as if preparing for a home inspection. Steve stood near the doorway, arms crossed, looking not at me but around me, the way someone looks at a property line. "We're meeting with the specialist this afternoon," he announced. "He'll stop by next week for the evaluation." I kept my face still. "What evaluation?" He hesitated a moment too long. "Just routine, a safety assessment." Routine safety assessments don't require lawyers or paperwork prepared in advance. But he didn't expect me to know that. Or perhaps he didn't care if I knew. They believed momentum itself would confuse me into surrender. Chloe began opening pill bottles, shaking them, checking labels, as if she were afraid they might explode. "Mom, you have duplicates. And the dosages, well, they're confusing. I don't know how you keep track." "I read the labels," I said, "the same way I always have." She lined everything into rows, morning, afternoon, evening, like a display in a pharmacy window. Then she pulled out a color-coded chart she'd made, as if rehearsing for a role in some performance she desperately wanted to be praised for. "From now on," she said, "Steve and I will bring your weekly medications in pre-sorted packets. It'll eliminate any errors." I didn't answer, not because I lacked one, but because silence, used well, makes people reveal their intentions faster. Steve moved through the house again, checking the smoke alarms he'd already replaced, walking through each room with a familiarity that grew bolder each visit. When he reached the back door, he punched in the code he still hadn't given me, watching the lock click open. "Good," he murmured, "still functioning." My own home had become a place where I needed permission to exit. "Mom," Chloe said gently, almost sweetly, "I've been thinking, maybe it's time you stayed with one of us for a while, just until everything settles." "Everything?" I asked. She smiled like someone offering a gift. "The transition." The word landed cold. Steve stepped back into the kitchen. "It's safer, Mom. And honestly, it'll make the legal process smoother." So they were no longer hiding it. They weren't just preparing for control. They were preparing for permanence. I looked at Steve's face. Older than I remembered. Tighter around the mouth. A man accustomed to closing negotiations, not opening conversations. My son, who once cried when he broke a toy, now strategized how to break his mother's independence. "No," I said simply. Chloe's expression tightened. "Why not? You can't live alone right now." I met her eyes. "Because I am living alone. Right now." They exchanged the familiar glance, the one that dismissed me faster than words ever could. Chloe placed her hand on my arm. "Mom, resisting doesn't help. We're trying to make this easier." "For whom?" I asked. Neither answered. When they left later that afternoon, after reorganizing my pantry again, after checking the camera feed twice, after reminding me that next week's evaluation was just a formality, the door shut behind them with a soft click. The house stiffened into a strange quiet. Not peaceful, not comforting, watchful. I stood in the center of my kitchen, surrounded by labeled containers and color-coded charts, and realized something with a clarity so sharp it steadied my breath. They weren't going to stop. Not on their own, not gently, not ever. And if I didn't push back soon, There would come a day, very soon, when they would walk through my door and never hand my keys back. But I have lived a long life, long enough to know that people underestimate the quiet ones. They mistake composure for surrender. They mistake age for confusion. They don't realize how wrong they are. By Sunday afternoon, I could no longer pretend their visits were accidents of timing or bursts of concern. They moved with the rhythm of people fulfilling a plan they had rehearsed. Arrive, assess, adjust, correct. My home had become a stage, and I was merely the character they needed me to be. Frail, confused, grateful. I played none of those roles. When they showed up again after lunch, I didn't offer tea. I didn't move toward the kitchen at all. I stayed seated at the table, my hands folded, my back straight. Steve hesitated when he saw me like that. Chloe didn't notice. She bustled in with her tote bag again, a general ready to command. "Mom," she began, "we need to talk about the evaluation tomorrow." "Good," I said. "I've been wanting to talk too." She blinked at the firmness in my tone. Not anger, just clarity. It always unsettles people who believe they're managing you. Steve pulled out a chair but didn't sit. "We know you're overwhelmed, Mom. This is a lot of change." "I'm not overwhelmed," I said. "I'm watching." "Watching what?" he asked. "Watching you both prepare for something you won't name." Chloe gave a soft sigh, the kind used on stubborn toddlers. "Mom, we've explained this. The evaluation is to make sure you're safe here." "And what if the result says I am? Will you return my keys then?" Silence. A long one. Their eyes shifted, almost together. That was answer enough. Chloe tried first. "Mom, you're resisting the very help you need." "I need help?" I asked quietly. "Or do you need control?" Steve stiffened. "That's unfair." "Then clarify it for me," I said. "Your truths should be steady enough to hold." He finally sat, rubbing his forehead like someone forced into a difficult negotiation. Chloe placed her hand on my arm again, light, rehearsed, patronizing. "Mom, you've had close calls. You're forgetting things. You fell. You left the kettle on." "I did not leave the kettle on." She froze, then continued, forcing gentleness. "Even if you don't remember doing it, that just proves—" "I remember everything," I said, "including what you are doing now." Steve glanced toward the hallway, at the back door with the coded lock. A small thing, yet a loud symbol. They had already begun imagining a world where I had no say in my own home. "Mom," he tried again, "this evaluation is not a punishment. It's just the first step." "I know," I said. "The first step toward guardianship." He didn't answer. Chloe looked down at her hands. Their silence was the purest truth they had spoken all week. "You've talked to a lawyer," I continued. "You've prepared paperwork. You've arranged this evaluation not because I'm unsafe, but because you want legal authority." They stared at me, startled not by the accusation, but by the precision of it. Chloe's voice tightened. "We are doing this for your well-being." "Say that again," I said softly, but without looking at each other for reassurance. She couldn't. Their version of love had become something twisted, protective in language, possessive in practice. I could see fear now in Steve's expression, but not fear for me. Fear of losing momentum. "I want to make something clear," I said. "I have lived alone since your father died. I pay my bills, I cook my meals, I drive, I make decisions. I don't need supervision." "You do," Steve snapped, the sweetness evaporating. "You just don't see it." "And you," I replied, "see only what benefits you." He jolted as if struck. People hate when their motives are spoken plainly. Chloe stepped in quickly. "Mom, please. We're trying to make this less painful." "Less painful for whom?" I asked again. "Because so far, all the pain has been mine." Her voice cracked. "Why can't you trust us?" "Trust is earned," I said, "not taken." Something in the room shifted. Their posture changed, stiffened. For the first time since this began, they seemed unsure of their footing. They had expected tears, fear, compliance. Not stillness. Not a woman sitting quietly with her dignity intact. "Tomorrow," I said, "I will speak to the evaluator, but you will not speak for me." "Mom, that's not how it works," Steve protested. "That is exactly how it works," I answered. "And if you believe otherwise, then perhaps you should be evaluated." He went pale. Chloe looked shocked. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean forward. I simply said what needed saying. "You wanted a conversation," I finished. "Now you've had one." They left not long after, quieter than usual, walking toward their car with the unsteady steps of people who have discovered their plan has cracks. And I sat at my table long after the engine faded, hands still folded, breath calm. Tomorrow would be the beginning of something new. Not the end they imagined, the beginning of resistance. The evaluator arrived on Monday morning, 10 minutes earlier than scheduled. I heard the car door outside, then the slow, deliberate steps of someone trained to observe before entering. Through the window, I saw a man around 50, tidy suit, briefcase, expression neutral to the point of practice. A man who made his living deciding where old people belonged. Steve and Chloe had timed their arrival to match his, as if they feared a single unsupervised minute might ruin their script. When the evaluator knocked, Steve opened the door instead of me. "Mr. Carver," he said warmly, shaking the man's hand. "Thanks for fitting us in." Us. That word again. I stood in the living room, waiting. Not because I couldn't walk to the door, but because I wanted Mr. Carver to see exactly who was in control of this house and who wasn't. He approached me with a polite, cautious smile. "Mrs. Allison, I'm here to conduct a functional and cognitive safety assessment." I nodded. "Then you'd best speak to me. I'm the one who lives here." A flicker of acknowledgement passed through his eyes. A small victory. Chloe moved closer, almost circling me. "We'll stay nearby in case you need help answering anything." "I won't," I said. Mr. Carver cleared his throat. "Actually, it's standard procedure to speak with the elder alone for most of the assessment." The surprise on Chloe's face was almost comical. Steve's jaw tightened. They had counted on guiding the conversation. "Well," Chloe tried, "Mom tends to get flustered under pressure." I looked directly at Mr. Carver. "No, I don't." Steve stepped in. "She forgets details, sometimes whole conversations." "Do I?" I asked quietly. "Mr. Carver, would you like to begin?" If the evaluator noticed the tension, he didn't show it. He opened his briefcase, took out a tablet, and turned to me. "Let's talk in the dining room." I walked ahead of him on purpose, not hurried, but steady enough to make a point. He watched my gait, the way professionals do, noting each step. We sat across from each other at the table. Steve and Chloe lingered in the doorway until Mr. Carver gently, but firmly, nodded them out. They obeyed, reluctant, stiff, exposed. The door closed. He began with orientation questions, date, time, address. I answered each with calm clarity. Then memory recall. Then numerical sequencing. Then safety habits. He watched me intensely, not unkindly, just as a man whose decisions affect lives. When he asked about my fall, I described it exactly as it had happened. Uneven pavement, sudden misstep, nothing more. My doctor confirmed no cognitive concerns, I added. The bruise healed in a week. He nodded. And the kettle incident? There was no kettle incident, I said. There was a daughter who arrived before the water boiled and misinterpreted her own impatience. His eyebrows lifted a fraction. Noted. And how do you manage your medications? By reading labels, by routine, by competence. You may check any bottle in this house. Nothing is out of order. He did. Every bottle correct. Then he asked something my children hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Allison, have your children made any changes to your living space recently? Many, I answered, without consent. Such as? Cameras, a coded lock I cannot open, rearranged shelves, restricted access to belongings. He tapped his tablet. Have they taken anything from you? My house keys. He paused. Did you give them voluntarily? No. Another note. And how do you feel about their involvement in your daily decisions? I looked at him steadily. It is not involvement. It is intrusion, disguised as concern. He didn't argue. He didn't soften. He only listened, which was more respect than I'd received in days. The assessment lasted nearly an hour. When it was done, he asked if I had any concerns I wished to state formally. Yes, I said. I am competent. I am capable. I am steady. And I am being pressured into relinquishing independence for reasons unrelated to my health. Financial reasons? He asked carefully. You said that? I replied. Not me. But the truth hung in the air. He thanked me, stood, and opened the door. Steve and Chloe rushed forward, their faces tight with expectation. Well? Chloe asked. Did she manage? Mr. Carver adjusted his glasses before answering. Mrs. Allison is articulate, oriented, and fully aware of her circumstances. Steve forced a smile. Yes, but you know how she can present well even when… She presents, Mr. Carver interrupted, exactly as a competent adult. Their faces drained. He continued, I will finalize my report, but based on what I've seen, there is no immediate safety concern warranting guardianship or removal from her home. Silence swallowed the room. They tried to mask their disappointment, but truth shows in the eyes before the mouth can catch up. Mr. Carver turned to me. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Allison. Your clarity was appreciated. When he left, the house felt lighter. My children, however, looked heavier. Chloe set her tote bag down with a thud. Mom, she said, struggling to soften her voice, you made this harder than it needed to be. No, I answered. I made it accurate. Steve didn't speak. Not right away. He only stared at me as if trying to understand how I had slipped out from under the net they were so certain would hold. They had believed control was a straight path. They had forgotten that I have lived long enough to recognize when someone is drawing a circle around me. And I do not stand still inside circles. After Mr. Carver's report, something shifted in the house. Not in the walls or the air. Those had always been loyal to me. But in the way my children moved. Their steps were sharper now, quicker, as if they sensed time slipping away from their plan. They had counted on a clean win, an evaluation declaring me confused, unstable, in need of supervision. Instead, they were left with the same mother they'd tried so hard to reframe as fragile. I didn't celebrate. I simply felt the steadiness of truth settling back into my bones. But truth isn't enough when people have already prepared for war. So I began preparing, too. The first thing I did was retrieve a small notebook from the drawer of my bedside table. A plain black cover, nothing remarkable. But it had always served me well in life. During my husband's illness, during the years when bills piled faster than paychecks. A place to keep details straight. Details matter, especially when others twist them. I sat at the dining table and wrote the date. Then, keys taken without consent. Cameras installed in 2 rooms. Medication cabinet rearranged. Lock code withheld. Not dramatic, just factual. Clean lines of ink that would mean something to anyone who knew how to read patterns. Chloe's words. Steve's actions. Their contradictions. I wrote those down too. I kept the notebook close, almost like a companion. Whenever they spoke to me in that honeyed tone, the one people use when they've decided your thoughts no longer matter, I wrote down the words exactly as they fell. Not to punish them, but to protect myself from their rewriting of events. My memory was fine, but memory is easily dismissed. Paper is harder to argue with. When Steve showed up the next morning to double-check the electrical outlets, I noted the time, the excuses he offered, the way he drifted toward the cabinet where my financial papers were kept. He didn't touch anything, but his eyes lingered a fraction too long. After he left, I photographed the cabinet, then the lock, then the camera near the entryway, all stored quietly in a folder on my phone labeled simply documents, not secrets, just preparations. Chloe came later with a meal she insisted I couldn't manage to cook myself. I thanked her, though I didn't eat it. I wrote down her phrasing, the odd, persistent way she avoided eye contact, the slip she made when she said, "Once we get everything approved." Approved by whom? For whom? I didn't ask. I just wrote. By Thursday, I had a small archive. Times, words, actions, contradictions. The shape of a story only I seemed willing to tell. That evening, I sat in my living room, the notebook open on my lap, rereading the entries. The pages didn't make me sad. They made me clear. My children weren't villains. They were simply convinced that fear and money justified their choices. But I wasn't going to let their fear rewrite the rest of my life. I closed the notebook and placed it beside me on the couch. Through the window, I could see the street, calm as ever. Neighbors walking their dogs. The familiar world still moving with its everyday rhythm. And for the first time since they'd taken my keys, I felt something almost like reassurance. Because preparation isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It's quiet, steady, deliberate. And I had always been good at those things. My children thought they were building a case, but so was I. By Friday morning, the air in my home felt charged, as if the walls themselves sensed what was coming. My children had grown impatient, not openly, no raised voices, no slammed doors, but in the briskness of their steps, the clipped tone of their sentences, the way they paused before speaking, as though rehearsing lines in a play whose ending they refused to let me alter. I knew the signs of escalation. People become bolder when subtlety fails them. Steve arrived first. He didn't bother with a greeting. He walked into the kitchen and inspected the counter, the stove, the sink, each with the air of a landlord evaluating a tenant's habits. "Mom," he said finally, "you shouldn't be using the stove alone." I folded my hands on the table. Yet, dinner has appeared on my plate every night. Fascinating. He ignored the remark, opening cupboards as if checking for evidence. I made another small note in my mind. Searches for reasons after failing to find proof. Chloe came 10 minutes later, her expression already tense. She carried a stack of printed forms clipped neatly at the corner. "Mom," she began. "We need to go over something important." "I imagine you do," I answered. "Sit." She didn't. She hovered, her nerves too restless to let her settle. Steve joined her side, their posture aligned like soldiers in formation. Chloe held up the papers. "We've arranged for you to stay with me for a few weeks." "No," I said. She blinked. "Mom, it's temporary." "No." Steve exhaled sharply. "This is for your safety." "Whose safety?" I asked. "Is compromised when I sleep in my own bed?" They looked at each other, and in that small glance I saw everything. Frustration, entitlement, a shared certainty that my resistance was nothing more than stubborn confusion. Chloe softened her voice. "Mom, it'll make the transition easier." "Transition to what?" Silence. A short, definitive silence. Steve stepped forward. "We're trying to avoid court, Mom." Ah, there it was. The quiet threat presented as mercy. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I am not moving." They didn't expect the steadiness in my voice. Age had made it deeper, but not weaker. Chloe pressed on. "Mom, you don't understand how this looks on paper. The fall, the forgetfulness, the disorganization. The evaluator only saw a snapshot." "He saw what exists," I said. "And what doesn't." Steve's frustration broke through. "You think a notebook and a few rehearsed answers make you competent?" I met his eyes. "No. My life makes me competent." He looked away. Chloe opened her folder again, flipping to the second page. "If you refuse to come voluntarily, we'll have to seek temporary guardianship until the court resolves." "You may file whatever you like," I said, "but you will not take me from my home." Steve's voice hardened. "We can't let you stay here alone." "And I said, "will not go anywhere with people who believe removing my autonomy is an act of love." Something broke in Chloe then, not loudly, but visibly. A crack in her certainty. "This is for your own good," she whispered. "No," I replied. "It's for your convenience." Steve stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Mom, don't make this complicated." "It already is," I said. "You made it so." They stood there, caught between anger and disbelief. Their plan required a compliant mother. Instead, they had me. Finally, Chloe closed the folder with a frustrated snap. "We'll come back tomorrow. Think this over." "I won't," I said. Steve stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to memorize the woman who refused him. Then they left. No hugs, no reassurances, just the sound of a door closing on a conversation they had lost control of. When the house grew quiet again, I sat down with my notebook. I wrote the time, their words, their insistence, their threat. The ink dried smooth and steady, just like my resolve. They had escalated. And if they believed that would frighten me into surrender, they still did not understand the simplest truth. I have lived alone for 8 years. Fear does not run this house. I do. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, not from pain or worry, but from a single quiet thought that settled into my mind like a stone. It was time to speak to someone who actually listened. Not a child, not a specialist. Someone whose job wasn't to guide me into surrender, but to protect my rights. I dressed slowly, choosing clothes that made me feel like myself. Nothing fancy, just a clean blouse, sturdy shoes, my old coat. It was still my life, after all, and I intended to keep it. I left the house without calling Chloe or Steve. They believed the coded lock had solved that possibility, but they had forgotten the back window in the laundry room, painted shut for years until I finally fixed it myself last spring. A detail they never bothered to learn about their mother. I lifted it, stepped through, and walked out into the cold morning air with the steadiness of a woman reclaiming something small but vital. The lawyer's office was 3 blocks away, in a modest brick building that had once been a bakery. I chose him because he wasn't flashy. I don't trust people who sell solutions like they sell perfumes. I trust people who look you in the eye and don't rush your sentences. His name was Daniel Rowe, a man in his late 40s with tired eyes that suggested he'd seen too many families unravel over paperwork and fear. When I explained why I'd come, he didn't interrupt me. Not once. He listened the way my husband used to, quietly, attentively, with the patience of someone who understands that the truth needs room to breathe. When I finished, he folded his hands. "Mrs. Allison," he said, "what you've described isn't uncommon, but that doesn't make it acceptable." "I'm not here to accuse them," I said. "I'm here because they've mistaken my cooperation for incapacity." He nodded. "They're trying to create a narrative before you can counter it." "Yes. Then we need documentation," he said. "Records, dates, changes in the home, statements they've made, actions taken without your consent. Anything that shows a pattern." I opened my bag and placed my notebook on his desk. He flipped through it slowly. Not quickly, slowly. His eyebrows lifted when he reached the page describing the coded lock, the cameras, the taken keys. "This is thorough," he said. "You've already done half my job." "I've always been organized," I said. "They forgot that." He asked if I felt unsafe. "No," I said. "I feel invaded. That's different." He nodded again, and I could see the respect forming behind his eyes. "Here's what we'll do," he said. "I'll draft a formal notice revoking their authority to intervene without your consent. I'll prepare a statement affirming your capacity, and if they file for guardianship, we'll be ready." A pause. "Do you expect them to file?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "They've already begun." He understood, truly understood. Before I left, he looked at me carefully. "Mrs. Allison, you're clear-minded. You're articulate. You're steady. You're far from the picture they're trying to paint." "I know," I replied. "I simply needed someone else to know it too." Outside, the sun had warmed the sidewalk. The wind felt softer than it had in days. I walked home with the firm, quiet awareness that I was no longer standing defenseless in the middle of their plans. I wasn't preparing to beg for my life. I was preparing to protect it. When I reached my house, the coded lock blinked its unwelcoming red light. But I didn't mind. I had climbed through the laundry window once. I could do it again if necessary. Inside, the rooms felt different. Not just mine by ownership, but mine by intention. Every step, every object, every quiet corner belonged to a woman who had finally stopped waiting for her children to rediscover their integrity. I placed the lawyer's card in the drawer next to my notebook. 2 small objects, but powerful ones. My children thought they were tightening their grip, but they had no idea I had already begun loosening it. The day before court felt strangely calm, like the air right before a storm. Heavy, expectant, but still. I woke early, long before the sun, and sat at the dining table with a cup of tea cooling between my hands. I didn't drink it. I just held it, letting the warmth gather in my palms as my thoughts organized themselves without hurry. They would come today. Of course they would. People don't let go of control easily, especially when they believe they've nearly secured it. I spent the morning tidying my home, not out of nervousness, but out of a need for order. I dusted the shelves, folded a blanket, wiped the counter. Small, ordinary gestures that reminded me this was still my space, no matter how many locks they changed or cameras they installed. A house remembers its owner even when the owner is pushed to the edges. By noon, the doorbell rang. 2 firm presses, their signal. Steve entered first, his eyes moving through the room with a fast, restless calculation. Chloe followed, carrying a binder now, no tote bag, no pretense. A binder meant preparation, certainty, the final phase of an argument built on fragile assumptions. "Mom," Steve said, "we need to talk." "Yes," I replied. "We do." He hesitated, thrown off by my calm. He expected fear, defensiveness, something softer, easier to overcome. Chloe placed the binder on the table and opened it. "We met with our attorney this morning." I nodded. "I assumed." She looked startled, as if she'd forgotten I still had the ability to deduce simple things. She flipped to the first page. "We're filing for temporary guardianship tomorrow. The hearing will be quick. It's just a protective measure until the court sees the full evidence." "Evidence," I repeated, tasting the word. "And do you have any?" Steve leaned forward. "Mom, don't do this. Mr. Carver only saw you for an hour. He doesn't understand the full picture." "We do." "Do you?" I asked. "Or is this about securing your position before I secure mine?" They exchanged that familiar look, fear disguised as frustration. Chloe lowered her voice. "Mom, the court needs to see that you're cooperating. Fighting us will only make you look unstable." I let the sentence hang in the air. Then, "I went to my lawyer yesterday." Their faces snapped toward me, startled, like birds caught mid-flight. "A lawyer?" Chloe repeated. "Why would you—" "To protect myself," I said. "From the two of you." Steve tried to collect himself. "Mom, you don't understand the legal process. Anyone can file paperwork." "Yes," I agreed. "And you filed yours?" I filed mine. Chloe's hands trembled slightly as she turned another page in her binder. "Mom, this isn't how it's supposed to go. You're making everything adversarial." "Nothing about this has been cooperative," I replied. "You took my keys. You restricted my movements. You installed surveillance. You withheld a lock code in my own home. You prepared a legal case behind my back." "We were trying to help," Steve insisted. "Then why," I asked, "did you need a lawyer before you needed a conversation?" Silence. A slow, unraveling silence. Chloe finally shut the binder, defeated. "Mom, we're worried. You're making choices that aren't rational." "I made an appointment. I walked to it. I told the truth. These are rational things." Steve rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Look, the hearing is tomorrow." "If you oppose us, it'll get ugly." "It already is," I said. "You just expected me not to notice." They both stood then, almost simultaneously, as if the room itself had expelled them. Steve gathered the binder. Chloe smoothed her coat, and for a moment they looked like strangers. People who had walked too far down a road they didn't know how to back away from. Steve spoke last. "Mom, think about what you're doing." "I have," I said. "You should do the same." They left without hugging me. Their footsteps were sharper this time, clipped, hurried. Desperation changes a person's stride. When the door closed, I felt no triumph, only clarity. They weren't monsters. They were frightened, greedy, misguided, an unfortunate mixture that often leads people to harm the ones they claim to love. I turned off the light in the hallway and sat down again at the table. My notebook lay open, the pen beside it. I wrote the time, their words, their final attempt to break me before the judge could see I wasn't broken. Tomorrow would be loud. Tomorrow would be public. Tomorrow would be a reckoning. But tonight, the house was mine again, and that was enough. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. I had imagined something cavernous, echoing, imposing. Instead, it felt almost intimate. 4 walls, a few rows of benches, the judge's desk raised just enough to remind everyone where authority sat. Nothing dramatic, just a room where truth and lies had equal opportunity to speak. Steve and Chloe arrived together, crisp and neat, their expressions carefully arranged. They looked like people attending a job interview, not a hearing to take their mother's autonomy. They didn't approach me. They sat across the aisle, whispering, rehearsing what they already believed was a foregone conclusion. My lawyer, Daniel Rowe, greeted me with a polite nod. "Just answer clearly," he said. "You've already done the hard part." The hard part was surviving the week. Answering questions felt almost restful. When the judge entered, everyone rose. He was a tall man with steady eyes, the kind that saw through irrelevant details. I liked him immediately. He didn't seem interested in theatrics. He seemed interested in facts. The hearing began with Steve. He stood, smoothing his tie, speaking with that careful, performative sadness people use when trying to appear noble. "Your Honor, my mother has had multiple episodes of confusion. She's fallen. She forgets important things. She's left appliances running. She's disoriented. Chloe and I have been doing our best, but we're afraid she's no longer safe living on her own." His voice caught just slightly on the last sentence. A practiced tremor. The judge looked at him. What specific incidents prompted the petition for guardianship? Steve glanced at Chloe before answering. She nodded subtly. "She left the kettle on. She forgot the date of a doctor's appointment. She fell last month and didn't remember how it happened." "Is there documentation of medical concern?" the judge asked. Steve hesitated. "Well, no. But we know our mother. We've seen the decline." "Decline," the judge repeated, writing something down. Then Chloe spoke. "Your Honor, she's also been disorganized. Her bills are confusing. She misplaces medications. We worry about her wandering off." I almost laughed. I hadn't wandered anywhere in my life, not even emotionally. But her voice was smooth, confident. To someone who didn't know me, it might even sound true. The judge turned to Daniel. "Counselor?" Daniel stood. "Your Honor, none of what they just described aligns with the evaluator's report. Mr. Carver found Mrs. Allison fully competent, oriented, and capable of independent living." The judge nodded. "I've reviewed that report." Steve shifted in his seat. Chloe's jaw tightened. Daniel continued. "Moreover, my client reports actions taken without consent. Keys removed, locks changed, surveillance installed, her private belongings accessed. These behaviors suggest not concern, but an attempt to control." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Is that correct, Mrs. Allison?" I stood, slowly, but without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor." "Did you give permission for them to take your keys?" "No." "Did you authorize the installation of cameras?" "No." "Have you experienced confusion, disorientation, memory loss?" "No," I said. "My children mistook my silence for weakness." The judge studied me for several seconds, not doubting, evaluating. "Mrs. Allison, can you tell me what led to all this?" I breathed once, letting the air settle from my throat to my chest. "My children believe safety is the same thing as control," I said calmly. "They believe age is a disease. They believe fear gives them rights they do not have. I fell once. I forgot nothing. I manage my own life. I have for years." The courtroom was silent. Daniel asked. Mrs. Allison, do you wish to continue living independently? Yes, I said, because I am capable. Because independence is not a luxury. It is dignity. The judge nodded slowly, as though he had heard the truth clearly on the first try, but allowed the room the courtesy of catching up. Thank you, he said. Please take your seat. As I sat, I caught sight of Steve's face. Tight, pale, almost disbelieving. Chloe blinked rapidly, her composure cracking like thin ice under steady pressure. They had expected tears. They had expected confusion. They had expected the version of me they constructed on paper. Instead, they got the woman I have always been. A woman they underestimated. When the judge turned back to my children, something quiet but unmistakable shifted in the room. Steve straightened his shoulders as if preparing for impact. Chloe clasped her hands so tightly the knuckles whitened. They had spent weeks building a story about a fragile, faltering woman. Now they were forced to defend it under the weight of daylight. Mr. Allison, the judge said, you claim your mother is forgetful. Can you provide concrete examples? Steve opened his mouth, then closed it again. The confidence he'd displayed earlier was gone, replaced by a careful searching of memory for something that did not exist. Well, she forgets appointments. She forgot the date of her physical last month. Daniel rose slightly. Your Honor, Mrs. Allison has the appointment reminder card. It was written incorrectly by the receptionist. She attempted to correct it herself. I took the card from my bag and handed it to Daniel, who passed it to the judge. The judge examined it. The date is crossed out and rewritten, perfectly legible. He looked at Steve. This appears to be a clerical error, not confusion. Steve swallowed. But she misplaces things. Important things. The judge's voice remained level. Such as? Again, Steve hesitated. Every second of silence strengthened the ground beneath my feet. Then Chloe stepped in, eager to rescue him. Her pills, Your Honor. She gets them mixed up. Daniel spoke without waiting for permission. Your Honor, we brought the medication tray. Every bottle is correctly labeled and sorted. The judge gestured for it. Daniel handed it over. The judge examined each bottle with care. Indeed, everything is in order. Whose handwriting is this? He asked. Mine, I said. He nodded. Clear and organized. Chloe's smile faltered. But she might have sorted them right before the hearing. She does that. Over-prepares when she's nervous. I looked at her calmly. I've taken my medication the same way for 8 years. The judge didn't scold her, but he didn't need to. His silence did enough. He turned another page. You also claim your mother wanders off. Chloe jumped in. Yes, she left the house without telling anyone. Daniel cleared his throat. Your Honor, she walked to my office for legal counsel. That landed with a satisfying stillness. The judge leaned back. Mrs. Allison sought legal advice independently? Yes, Daniel answered. She scheduled the appointment, arrived on time, provided documents, and articulated her concerns clearly. Steve whispered something to Chloe, panicked, almost desperate. The judge noticed. He turned to them. You also took your mother's keys. Why? Steve straightened. We were afraid she'd fall again. Did her physician recommend restricting her access to her own home? Steve glanced at Chloe. Not formally. And the cameras? The judge asked. For safety, Chloe said quickly. Elder monitoring. Lots of families do it. Did your mother consent? She froze. Well, she didn't object. I didn't know, I said quietly, until the red light came on. The judge wrote something down. I didn't need to know what it was. I could feel it gathering weight in the air. "And the coded lock?" he asked. Chloe's voice thinned. "We were afraid she'd go out alone." "And where?" the judge asked. "Has she ever gone that put her in danger?" Neither spoke. Their silence had become a character in the room, loud, fumbling, unmistakable. Daniel approached the bench. "Your Honor, Mrs. Allison has demonstrated not only competence, but awareness of her circumstances. She has documented the changes made to her home, the pressure placed upon her, and the pattern of control exerted by her children. None of these actions stem from medical necessity." The judge closed the folder. "I've heard enough." Chloe's breath caught. Steve's jaw tightened. The judge looked at me, not with pity, but with respect. "Mrs. Allison, is there anything you wish to say before I make my ruling?" I rose again, steady. I didn't reach for the table. I didn't need to. "Yes, Your Honor. Only this. I can accept aging. I can accept help. I cannot accept being erased." The judge nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Thank you, Mrs. Allison." And in that moment, the outcome was already clear. The judge adjusted his glasses, glanced once more at the folder before him, then closed it with the quiet certainty of a man who had already made up his mind. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Even the air felt still, waiting for the truth to solidify into something permanent. "Having reviewed the petition," he began, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge, "and the independent evaluator's report, as well as the testimony provided today, I find no evidence, none, that Mrs. Allison is unable to manage her affairs or live independently." Chloe's hand flew to her mouth. Steve's shoulders collapsed inward, as if the words themselves had weight. The judge continued, "On the contrary, the testimony demonstrates that Mrs. Allison remains articulate, organized, and fully capable of self-care. Her actions, including seeking legal counsel, indicate sound judgment." I sat still, not triumphant, not shaken, simply present. The judge looked directly at my children. "The court is concerned by several actions taken by the petitioners: removing a parent's house keys without consent, installing surveillance equipment in a private home, restricting access to doors and personal property. These raise serious questions about motive." Chloe began to speak. "Your Honor, we were only trying—" He held up a hand. "I've heard your explanations. The court does not find them sufficient." Her face went pale. Steve stared at the floor. The judge leaned forward, folding his hands. "Guardianship is an extreme measure, reserved for individuals who cannot meet their own basic needs. It is not, and will never be, a tool for family convenience or financial positioning." That sentence hung heavier than all the others. "Therefore," he said, "the petition for temporary guardianship is denied." My children froze. "And furthermore," he added, "any continued attempts to limit Mrs. Allison's autonomy without cause may be interpreted as potential financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. This court will not hesitate to involve protective services should such patterns persist." Chloe's eyes filled, not with remorse, but with insult. The kind of hurt felt by people who believe their intentions should matter more than their actions. Steve finally lifted his head. "So, that's it?" he asked, voice small. "That," the judge said, "is the ruling." Daniel placed a gentle hand on my arm, a subtle acknowledgement, not celebration. My body felt grounded, every muscle held by the simple truth that I had defended myself without theatrics or collapse. Age had taken some things from me, but not the essential ones. As the judge stood to leave, he paused and addressed me directly. Mrs. Allison, you have conducted yourself with clarity and dignity. I encourage you to set boundaries that protect your independence." "I intend to," I said. He nodded once, then left through the side door. People began to rise. Papers rustled. The room exhaled. My children didn't move. They looked like two people forced to confront the shape of their own choices, and the shape did not flatter them. I gathered my bag, closed the notebook that had carried so much weight, and waited. If they wanted to speak, I would hear them. If they didn't, I would leave. Steve was the first to rise. "Mom, we didn't mean for it to go this way." I met his eyes. "It didn't go this way. You pushed it here." Chloe wiped her cheek, though no tear had fallen. "We were just scared." "So was I said. "The difference is, I didn't try to take your life away when I was afraid." They had no reply. Not because they had none, but because the truth had already been spoken aloud in a room where people could not pretend it was something else. I stood. Daniel offered his arm, but I didn't take it. I walked out of the courtroom on my own, steady and unhurried, feeling my steps return to me. I had not won anything. I had simply kept what was mine. And sometimes that is the greater victory. When I returned home after the hearing, the house felt different. Not because anything in it had changed, but because I had. For the first time in weeks, I unlocked the front door with a key that belonged to me, and the simple turn of metal in a familiar lock sent a warmth through my chest I hadn't felt in years. Ownership is not a document. It's a feeling that sits in your bones. I stepped inside and closed the door gently, almost ceremonially. The camera's red light blinked in the corner, like an unwelcome guest who had overstayed. I walked toward it, unplugged it from the socket, and placed it on the counter. No anger, no triumph. Just the end of something that never should have begun. The coded lock on the back door took longer. Steve had installed it with the enthusiasm of a man securing property, not protecting a person. Daniel had advised me how to handle it legally. A locksmith arrived within the hour. He was an older man himself, with steady hands and no interest in asking questions that weren't his to ask. "Family trouble?" he said quietly as he worked. "Just fixing what shouldn't have been touched," I replied. He nodded as if he understood. Perhaps he did. Many older people understand these things without details. When he removed the device, the door looked like itself again. Unburdened. Honest. A simple lock and key, my key, restored. Inside, I went room by room, reclaiming small territories. The shelf they had reorganized without asking. The medicine cabinet they had color-coded like I was a patient in a ward. The pantry they had rearranged into categories that made sense only to them. I undid each change quietly, not out of spite, but because a home is built through small rituals. Where one keeps the tea, where the sugar sits, which mug lives closest to the kettle. Those are not little things. They're the architecture of a life. By late afternoon, the house breathed easier. I brewed tea, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to hear the kettle boil without someone hovering at my shoulder. That small whistle felt like the return of my own voice. While it cooled, I opened my notebook. For the first time in weeks, there was no new entry to add, no intrusion to record, no insult disguised as kindness. The page remained blank, not with avoidance, but with peace. I closed it and placed it in the drawer, not as evidence anymore, just as memory. Then I sat at my table and began making calls. The first was to my bank. I updated access permissions, removed names, set alerts. The woman on the line was polite, efficient, and didn't ask why my adult children had once been listed. It wasn't her business, and I appreciated the discretion. The second call was to my insurance company, the third to the utility providers. Each one was the same: simple, steady, reclaiming. When I finished, I felt neither vindictive nor triumphant. Only aligned. My life back in my hands, the way it had been long before fear made my children believe they had rights over me. As the sun began to set, I stepped out onto my porch. The boards creaked the way they always had, a familiar complaint that somehow comforted me. Across the street, Mrs. Lang watered her hydrangeas. She waved. I waved back. The neighborhood hadn't changed. The world hadn't changed. Only the way I occupied it had been restored. Inside, I locked the front door with my key, not out of fear, but out of choice. I didn't need anyone to approve it. I didn't need anyone to supervise it. And when I turned off the lights and walked down the hallway, the house felt like it had been waiting for exactly this moment. Not for the children to return to caring for me, but for me to return to caring for myself. Tomorrow, life would go on. But tonight, it was mine again. Quiet, whole, undisturbed. The next morning, I woke without an alarm, without footsteps in the hallway, without anyone hovering behind a closed door waiting to correct the way I lived. The house was quiet, not the tense, watchful quiet of the past weeks, but the natural hush that comes when a home is finally allowed to return to being a home. The sun pushed gently through the curtains. I sat on the edge of my bed, letting the warmth reach my hands. My joints ached, of course. They always would. Age does not bargain, but the ache was mine alone, and somehow that made it lighter. I rose slowly, moving through the rooms with no urgency, touching objects that had survived the storm with me: the bookshelf, the wooden banister, the worn rug that everyone else saw as outdated, but that still carried the imprint of my life. Each detail reminded me of something simple. I had endured, not dramatically, not loudly, just by refusing to be erased. I made breakfast, not because anyone needed proof I could, but because I wanted the smell of toast and butter to fill the kitchen again. I brewed tea, watching the kettle come to boil without interruption. No hands reaching to take it from me. No voices suggesting I sit, rest, yield. Just me and the whistle of the kettle, a small, steady sound of freedom. Around noon, I stepped outside to water my plants. The hydrangeas needed trimming. The basil had begun to stretch sideways toward the sun. Ordinary tasks, but grounding ones. Mrs. Lang waved from across the street again. This time, I walked over. She tilted her head. "You look lighter today." "I am," I said. She didn't ask why. Older women understand victories that don't need retelling. When I went back inside, I stood for a long moment in the center of the living room. The same room where my children had spoken to me like a problem to be solved. Where they rearranged my life in neat little bins and charts. Where they believed age had hollowed me out. But age doesn't hollow you, it distills you. What remains is the truth, raw, sturdy, unmovable. I sat down with my notebook, flipped through the pages filled with dates and words and small betrayals. Then I turned to the very last page and wrote only one line. I kept myself. Nothing more. I closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer, not as ammunition, but as testimony. I didn't need it to defend myself anymore. The judge had seen me, and more importantly, I had seen myself clearly. Later that evening, Steve called. Not to argue, not to insist, just to ask if I needed anything. His voice was strained, careful. A man questioning the shape of the authority he once assumed was his. "No," I said gently. "I'm fine." He hesitated. "Mom, can we come visit? Not to talk about anything, just visit." "Not today," I replied, "but another time. When you come as my children, not as my guardians." He understood, maybe for the first time. When the call ended, I opened my window. The evening breeze crept in, soft and cool. I breathed it in, slowly, fully, without fear of being watched or managed. This was not a triumphant ending. It was something better. A return. A reclamation. A quiet standing in place that said, without theatrics, I am still here. Not diminished, not confused. Not lost. A woman who learned that defending dignity doesn't always look like a battle. Sometimes it looks like holding a house key in your palm and knowing it is yours in every way that matters. Before bed, I sat for a long time in the dark, listening to the steady heartbeat of the home around me, the creaks in the floorboards, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock, all of it whispering the same simple truth. I survived the people who thought they were saving me, and I saved myself. And if an old woman can do that, quietly, steadily, then perhaps someone reading these words can too. If you've ever felt pushed aside, unheard, or underestimated, speak. Write. Stand. Your life is still yours. And if you want more stories like this one, stories of women who weren't done when everyone assumed they were, stay close. There's more to tell.